A dictator is someone who has absolute power over a society or a people, and Vladimir Putin, be in no doubt, is a dictator.
North Korea is without a doubt the most repressive regime in the world today. It's been able to maintain a system of such high levels of control over their citizens, like in a way we've never really seen before.
Authoritarian rulers in this world, they don't want to leave the power base.
And I think that power, in most cases, starts off with a genuine ideology, no matter how warped that ideology is, and then gradually devolves into just power for power's sake.
There is a bit of breaking news that we want to get to, and that is a major escalation in Russia's incursion into Ukraine with the help of North Korea.
North Korean troops have been sent to Russia's front line with Ukraine in the Kursk region.
It reinforces the deepening relationship between the two countries after North Korea sent thousands of troops
wearing Russian uniforms are now on the march headed towards Ukraine's border.
This is a violation of the UN Security Agreement.
NATO calls on Russia and the DPRK to cease these actions immediately.
Russian President Vladimir Putin watched nuclear training exercises from the Kremlin yesterday.
And also a sign that Russia's president, Vladimir Putin, is desperate.
So this is pretty serious.
The ultimate goal of a dictator is to gain power, and then once you've got power, the goal of the dictator becomes to keep that power. You know, it's like you've won a gold medal, but people are wanting to snatch it away from you all the time, so you've got to keep holding on to the gold medal. It becomes a vicious circle, because in order to maintain power, you've got to get more powerful as you gain more enemies. And to get more powerful, you've got to restrict people's liberties more. So in fact, you get worse and worse. Power corrupts, it feeds on itself, and you end up becoming an evil bastard.
These number of rulers are increasing, unfortunately. I mean, the world is moving in that populist authoritarian direction.
Most dictators start off with good intentions. One thinks of Pinochet in Chile or Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, who they might be brutal, they might want to get rid of their opponents, but at the same time they have a real sort of modernizing goal for their country. And of course Putin's to some extent starts out in that kind of a way as well. He has a vision of restoring order in Russia and improving the prosperity after the really difficult sort of economic situation in the 1990s.
The Economist Intelligence Unit has a thing they do every year called the Democracy Index, which ranks countries according to their democracy. And it has 4 categories. It has full democracy, flawed democracy, hybrid regime, and authoritarian regime. Ukraine is 85th and Russia is 124th. And more to the point, Russia is deemed an authoritarian regime. So Russia is right down, out of 180 odd countries, Russia is right down in the bottom category in terms of its commitment or otherwise to democracy.
Are you concerned?
No, I'm not concerned. I think about the people, ordinary people in Russia. And of course, I see the protest groups, and I think about it, what I can to do with all our citizens.
Good evening, and we're coming on the air at this hour with breaking news after the U.S. warned all day of a full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, that it was imminent. Vladimir Putin has just addressed the Russian people moments ago, announcing what Putin called the start of a military special operation, in his words, to demilitarize Ukraine.
The problem that all dictatorships have is how to keep on regenerating, reviving their purpose. You come in and you do whatever it was that you wanted to improve things, but then how do you change? And that's really the difference between a dictatorial kind of a regime and a democratic regime. You know, the great advantage of democracy is that there's a means whereby countries can change peacefully, change without a revolution. But the problem is with dictatorships that there's no kind of internal mechanism for change. So things which might have worked early on work increasingly less well later on. But there's no succession mechanism. There's no way in which the country can change direction without either a palace coup or an assassination or, of course, the dictator dying.
For a dictator like Putin, what power means is having the ability to do whatever you feel like a kind of medieval king, or indeed, in Russia, of course, a czar, and you know, press a button and things just happen. There's no one argues against you. You have millions of people under your direct control, and they just have to go along with what you are saying. So the hallmarks of your average dictator, and all these Putin has in spades, are narcissism. You've got to love yourself, because you think you're worthy of this power.
A ruthlessness, certainly a ruthlessness.
You've also got to be very insecure, because let's face it, the average person, who actually wants all this power is probably missing something in their psychological makeup.
A commitment to power above almost everything else. A total mistrust of almost anybody and everything.
You've also got to be incredibly selfish. You've also got to try not to care what people think about you, although many dictators do have very thin skins indeed. You've also got to have the most enormous ego to actually believe that you deserve this power.
A willingness to go down the sort of personality cult route, especially, and again you saw that with Stalin, you saw that with Hitler, you see that with Putin, and you certainly see that with the 3 generations of the Kim family in North Korea. That it's all about the person in charge, the office and the incumbent become as one.
You've also got to be brilliant at managing the message. That is a very smart way of saying lying all the time to everybody. You've also got to have a lot of people who are loyal to you, who have helped you on the way up, and you've got to keep them loyal. And also, with those same people, you've also got to divide them. And what you want all those people to be doing beneath you is to be fighting each other rather than fighting you. This is what Putin does, this is what Hitler did, this is what Stalin did. It is dictator textbook tactics.
Vladimir Putin exercises significant control over Russia, guiding the nation with a keen focus on reasserting its global influence and countering Western dominance, particularly in light of the isolation imposed by the war in Ukraine. This ambition has prompted Putin to cultivate closer ties with North Korea, where Kim Jong-un similarly wields strict authority, emphasizing military power and regime stability in the face of international sanctions. Their partnership has deepened as Russia seeks arms and support from its ally. However, despite their shared authoritarian tendencies, North Korea operates under an exceptionally different totalitarian regime. So to fully comprehend this evolving alliance and the nature of their dictatorships, we must examine the histories of both countries.
And 60% of Hiroshima is wiped off the earth. Terrific climax to almost 4 years of Pacific struggle. So with Russia, Britain, and China, and the new power of the atomic bomb, all-out pressure on the Japanese Empire in its last hour of life.
The period of Japanese colonialism of Korea was incredibly brutal. The Japanese really wanted to completely erase Korean culture, Korean names, the Korean language. And so this period was very repressive, and you saw a lot of anti-imperial movements forming. After Japan was defeated, both the Soviet Union and the US were fighting to ensure some sort of sphere of influence over Korea.
Korea was a victim of the beginning of the Cold War. And if you think about the timing of this, the Second World War ends in 1945. It's the surrender of Japan, which then leads to Korea, in theory, gaining its freedom and independence from Japanese colonial rule. But immediately it's occupied by the two superpowers, new superpowers of the time. And immediately it's sort of thrown into the maelstrom of the emerging Cold War.
3, 2, 1.
People usually talk about the Cold War kind of beginning around about 1947, 1948. And it was in 1946, 1947 that the two superpowers, the US and Soviet Union, who were now occupying North and South Korea, it was during that period that they were negotiating what would happen to Korea. And they were both still paying lip service to the idea that Korea would be unified, it would be, free and independent. But in reality, while they were negotiating about this, they were also at the same time setting up friendly client states.
In the South, there was a huge movement for capitalism, for democracy, under the leadership of South Korean leader Syngman Rhee. And in the North, you of course had Kim Il-sung rising to power. He was noted as being an amazing guerrilla fighter, incredibly effective fighting against the Japanese, and he was impressing the Soviets with his communist credentials and his ability as a leader. Kim Il-sung really impressed the Soviets. He was young, he was incredibly smart and savvy, he was really charismatic, he was a great communicator, and he was also a fantastic guerrilla fighter, and he not only impressed the Soviets but impressed many other Koreans. Kim Il-sung was a great admirer of Stalin, and in particular the idea that one man, by using force, could unite a country and could help force modernization and development, industrialization, and so forth. But the war essentially started because Kim attacked the South, and he was able to very quickly move in the army until they captured almost all of the Korean peninsula.
The fact that communist forces have invaded Korea is a warning that there may be similar acts of aggression in other parts of the world. In view of the world situation, we need to build up our own Army, Navy, and Air Force over and above what is needed in Korea. We need to speed up our work with other countries in strengthening our common defenses.
So it is that on the eve of the 4th of July,
one of the key tactics used by the US throughout the Korean War from 1950 through to 1953 was very heavy aerial bombardment. I mean, effectively, they were using similar kind of tactics that had been used in the Second World War, in the Pacific War against Germany and against Japan, which was carpet bombing of urban areas, of industrial areas, and they used huge amounts of ordnance in North Korea, effectively flattening every urban area. They did also use a lot of firebombing, they used napalm, and there's been a long-standing rumor that they also used bioweapons.
The tactics that were used by the US in the Korean War were incredibly harsh. There were 635,000 tons of bombs that were dropped on North Korea, over 300,000 tons of napalm, and this was even more than what the US had dropped on Japan. So North Korea was almost completely destroyed. All of its industrial base, manufacturing, and so forth was destroyed by the Americans using incredibly harsh tactics. In fact, one of the military leaders, Curtis LeMay, indicated that 20% of the North Korean population had been killed by the U.S.
The most powerful contribution to that crusade was being made in Korea.
We have won an armistice on a single battleground, not peace in the world. We may not now relax our guard nor cease our quest. Throughout the coming months, during the period of prisoner screening and exchange, and during a possibly longer period of the political conference which looks toward the unification of Korea, we and our United Nation allies must be vigilant against the possibility of untoward developments.
After the 1953 agreement, you saw the U.S. replace Japan as North Korea's main enemy. There may be tensions, of course, with the South. Of course, they're competing with one another all the time. Some of it is even petty. But by far, from the North Korean perspective, its biggest enemy is the U.S. And this is something that North Koreans learn from birth, essentially. That the U.S. started the war, that the U.S. was so weak that they sought some sort of armistice, and that the U.S. is constantly threatening North Korea with nuclear weapons. The Korean War actually improved Kim Il-sung's popularity. Even though it ended in an armistice, he was able to sell it as something that was a victory for the North. There was all kinds of propaganda from the moment people woke up till the end of the day. And so this also was part of his image of being this wonderful military leader, something that he spent a great deal of time cultivating from his guerrilla roots, working against the Japanese regime, that he had the prowess, the military expertise to lead North Korea, and he was able to stand up against the Americans.
Over the last 4 decades, communist leader Kim Il-sung has been the object of a slavish personality cult. And this huge stage-managed birthday party was the climax of weeks of preparation. Guests at the jamboree included Chinese President Yang. But all the razzmatazz can't obscure North Korea's international isolation and a pressing need to develop Western trade links.
This is a big feature of 20th century politics, that we see cults of personality all over the place, but they become, particularly prevalent among the Soviet bloc countries. And you get a number of leaders like Kim Il-sung who, as well as copying the policies of Stalin and the kind of developmentalism of Stalin and the surveillance state of Stalin and so on, they also copy that cult of personality around the great leader.
Kim Il-sung was able to transform himself into a godlike figure by essentially creating a religion that was all about him. And this was the personality cult, where there were 40,000 statues that were built just for him, over 3,200 obelisks built, all kinds of monuments. And the personality cult was extensive.
While along those streets, groups of school children don't walk, they march to school. They sing praise to the great leader, chanting, "We are fighters for the ideas of Kim Il-sung."
From the moment that people started, or children started school, they were hearing about how wonderful and great Kim Il-sung was, hearing stories about his military expertise and ability to push out the Americans. This was a relentless form of propaganda, and there wasn't any access to any kind of outside information that would contradict this. So all the North Koreans really heard about was that he was their god, that he was the person that they needed to worship, and that it was really only this type of individual that had this type of knowledge that could save them from eternal misery. And upon hearing this day in, day out, you saw North Koreans became brainwashed by this and developed a type of respect and adoration towards Kim Il-sung that you might only see towards some sort of religious figure.
I think on one level we can say that people were profoundly shocked, right? I mean, this is someone who had been built up, as you say, as a kind of like a godlike figure, had permeated every aspect of people's lives, right? Always in the newspaper, always on the TV. Everywhere you go, there's something to do with the leader. There are pictures up on the walls of all buildings, more or less. So when someone who permeates people's daily lives so much, whether they like him or dislike him, love him or hate him, when someone permeates people's lives so much and then they go and they die, they disappear, I think that's a profoundly, shocking moment in people's lives.
While the outpouring of grief was essentially something that you could say was actually genuine for many people, there was also the fear factor involved, that you almost wanted to compete against your neighbor, to appear to be grieving more. And so when you see images of the outpouring of grief, of people screaming and crying and on bended knee as if they can't survive, this is really about showmanship. It's about proving to others, to the regime, to the authorities that they were the most loyal to Kim Il-sung.
Putin was one of those, frankly, slightly strange kids, being no doubt about it. He wasn't the kind of, jolly, gregarious, socially confident young man. This was a young man, a young boy, who actually knocks on the door of his local KGB office in St. Petersburg and says, "Can I have a job, please?" And they say to Putin, "Off you go." And Putin says, "Okay, well, what shall I go and do?" And they say, "Well, I don't know, go and study law." So dutifully, Putin pops around St. Petersburg University and gets himself a law degree.
In the Soviet Union at that time, a law degree did not mean that you would go and become a solicitor or a barrister as you would here. I mean, law was fundamentally an arm of the state, a politicized arm of the state. So law was a pretty good introduction into being a KGB agent.
Then comes back to the KGB and says, "Can I join you now?" And they go, "Yeah, all right."
They were called the sword and shield of the revolution. They were warriors for and defenders of the system, and he took great pride in that. So I think a combination of KGB and Leningrad has really shaped him.
But then he goes on to training school, and it's always been his ambition to work abroad, and especially work in the West. This is why he said he wanted to become a KGB agent in the first place. He's inspired by this film that the KGB had made in the 1960s called The Sword and the Shield.
У нас никому не отнять.
Kind of like the Soviet James Bond, the kind of secret agent who's placed in Nazi Germany, pretends to be a Nazi officer, and sending all the information back to the Soviet Union and defending the motherland, as it were. And so Putin says this is why he wants to become a secret policeman. I mean, that's, one person can make so much difference to the glory of the country, as it were.
Orwell's view of the thought police was not a million miles away from the Soviet Union. People got taken away for what we would regard as no reason whatsoever, and that had been the case all the way through. Being secretive is second nature to Putin, especially as a spy. You give away as little as you have to, and even then reluctantly. He was brought up very much within the folds of the system. His grandfather had been a cook for both Lenin and Stalin.
He catered one of the dachas, the country cottages, which was available for members of the Soviet elite. And so we don't know very much about him, but clearly his grandfather was very much somebody who was part of the establishment. You know, you would imagine that Lenin and Stalin would have been fairly careful about who was cooking their foods.
His father had worked for the NKVD, which were the forerunners of the KGB, the secret police. They came after the Cheka, and now the KGB are the FSB. Different names, same bunch of guys. During the Second World War, what the Russians call the Great Patriotic War, he was part of the NKVD's destruction battalions. And they were basically responsible for maintaining order, among other things. So they were just as savage towards their own people as they were towards the Nazis.
His father was evidently given a mission to locate himself behind enemy lines and disrupt the enemy in whatever ways. So it's a very risky mission and almost a suicide mission. I think only 4 of the 30 or so in his father's battalion actually ended up surviving. His unit was ambushed and he survives by lying underwater in a bog with a reed sticking out to the wall. I mean, we've no idea whether it's true or whether it's just kind of apocryphal. Well, when we're trying to speculate as to why young Vladimir wants to go and become a secret policeman, certainly his father's wartime history seems to be part of it.
But all this period probably taught him that KGB's effectivity is the ideal style system for the Russian bureaucracy. That's why when he put people in places, he always looked for someone he knows from the KGB background or from the intelligence background in the Russian system.
His 3 closest confidants right now, they all date back to the 70s. They all worked with him as KGB agents in Leningrad. So that, you know, that dies hard with Putin. He's very much a man of his place and of his time.
These people were the ones he relies on when he's doing these kind of international interventions in Syria and now in Ukraine.
The thing about Putin, he was good without being great, and therefore you would never have thought, as a young KGB agent, you know, if you lined up a lot of KGB agents in the late 80s and said, in 10 years' time, one of you guys will be president of Russia, you know, he would not have been the one you'd have chosen, not in a million years.
You asked me about 1990 or 91 when I was there. It was a hugely chaotic period economically. I remember there was nothing in the shops. Most of the shops were closed, and every day I was living in a flat in central Moscow. From archives to my flat, I was just walking around, sometimes 2 hours, just to see who is selling what. Just getting a few things from the street, because people were selling one orange here, a little bit of cheese there, some bread. So it was so chaotic. It was almost like a medieval period.
He resigns from the KGB during the coup against Mikhail Gorbachev in August 1991.
Gorbachev was on holiday in Crimea, and a bunch of hardliners basically tried to arrest what was the disintegration of the Union. They did it totally cat-handedly. Putin gave his loyalty to Anatoly Sobchak, who was his superior in the Leningrad KGB, and Sobchak supported Yeltsin because their view was that Gorbachev was the elected president of the Soviet Union and that any coup against him was unconstitutional. For Putin, the system was more important than any one person. He didn't hold with this kind of action from the putschists.
But actually, there's no evidence that he does resign from the KGB at that time. We certainly haven't got any documents which were like a letter of resignation or anything like that. And there's every reason to suppose actually that he doesn't, and that he remains intimately connected with the KGB. After the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union in 1991, he gets a job with the new democratically elected mayor in St. Petersburg. And really, the speculation is that the reason that Sobchak gives him a job is that he wants somebody who has KGB connections as his kind of tough guy, as his guy who can actually be the link person with the security services and the link person with organised crime.
It basically becomes his bag carrier, but what he's doing is he's forging connections by people, in industry, in politics, all around St. Petersburg. Putin is the indispensable grey man. He's not making speeches, he's not being a politician, he's simply being a functionary, he's being a bureaucrat. But what Putin knows, and what people often know, is that the people at the nexus of power, it's people in the margin, it's people at the meeting points of power, are the people who actually gain the power, because they're the people who knows what different people want, and they can manage those relationships. And suddenly, Putin finds himself, at the heart of power in St. Petersburg. He finds himself enriching himself because everything is corrupt. So that is a key part of the Putin narrative, that relationship with Sobchak.
All those pictures of those guys, he's never, he's always the one in the corner at the back, but he's always, obviously, by the same token, watching and absorbing information, and that sort of, he is the grey man, and yet he was the one who succeeded because obviously he was very smart about where to position himself and whose coattails to follow, and Sobchak was a very good guy to hitch his star to.
Государственным переворотом. Чрезвычайный съезд народных депутатов Союза. А тем временем началась подготовка к защите.
Loyalty is something that he was proud of in himself and values in other people. When Sobchak wasn't re-elected in 1996, Putin was offered a job by his successor and refused, saying, "I'd rather be hanged for loyalty than rewarded for betrayal," which is slightly melodramatic for a government job, but I think is also quite revealing. Again, that comes into the fact that he trusts his old KGB mates from the 70s. Loyalty is a very big thing for him.
Russia in the 1990s under Boris Yeltsin was certainly a very chaotic environment. Yeltsin and his government have been trying to create a market economy. Rather than creating a market economy, what they've done is that they've transferred ownership in the most important bits of the Russian economy to a small number of individuals who've become mega rich.
Russia's much more stable now. That pace of change was unsustainable, and it only happened because you'd gone from an incredibly restricted system to something where, certainly in economic terms, all bets were off. There's no legal system worth the name. Any country's stability is based fundamentally around the rule of law. You can talk about political diversity and political plurality and so on, but without a rule of law that is basically efficient and impartial, nothing happens. And in Russia at that time, there was no rule of law. If you had a disagreement with someone, you sorted it out with violence, because there was no, you couldn't have a business dispute and take it to the court. There were no courts. There was a ton of money floating around, and the money was getting bigger, especially because with the economic reforms, the exchange rates on the international market, the disparity was so huge that, you could buy a barrel of oil for next to nothing in rubles and sell it for a fortune in dollars. They call it the Wild East. Anything went. There's a word for them. They're called dorkadents. They were decadent dorks. They were the kind of dorks who back home would never have, got anywhere. But here they were sort of, they're driving around in limousines and beautiful women and champagne and so on, just because it was that time and place where they could, and it was anarchy. The memories of that time really die hard for lots of Russians, and actually for a lot of Russians, given them the choice between authoritarianism and the anarchy of the Yeltsin years, they'll take authoritarianism. They'll say, we don't want that anymore. Freedom is a pretty nebulous concept when there's anarchy around.
Meanwhile, back in North Korea, a new figure was poised to take center stage. Power was passing to the leader's son, and with the father's death, control shifted once again to the nation's second ruler.
Kim Jong-il was definitely an interesting character. He was sadistic. He was very antisocial. He was paranoid. He is neurotic, narcissistic, schizoid, an oddball, eccentric. Different than his father, that he didn't really have that type of charisma, almost never engaged in any kind of public speaking. He liked to spend his time drinking and eating the craziest delicacies that he could find, whether it be dolphins or donkey meat, and drank up to 450,000 pounds worth of cognac per year. So he's definitely a very different type of leader. Kim Jong-il was also really different than his father in terms of his style of leadership. Not only did he lack the charisma and that common touch, but he really centralized power and personalized power into his own hands. So whereas Kim Il-sung would often consult with his elites on matters of what to do and try to seek out other people's advice on things, you saw that Kim Jong-il really relied on no one. Kim Jong-il was born, and immediately there was myth around him. He was born in 1941 in February in Russia because his parents were living in exile, but instead the story was spread that he was born in North Korea in 1942, and that there was a double rainbow that formed after his birth. He wasn't a guerrilla fighter. He didn't have the military expertise and credentials that his father did. But he worked on propaganda, he worked within the party, and he worked to gain the respect of other people within the North Korean regime. And one of the things that was actually important for him consolidating power was by his military-first policy. For any authoritarian regime, the military usually poses some of the biggest threats to any kind of leader. And by ensuring that the military never starved, even in the face of the famine, he could prevent any potential coups to his regime.
It's a secretive Stalinist state claiming to possess several atom bombs, and now North Korea may be about to prove it for the very first time.
Kim Jong-il wanted to pursue nuclear weapons to have more importance on the world stage, which Kim Jong-il thought was important to just gaining any kind of bargaining power vis-a-vis other Western powers.
East German troops took control of the key section of the Berlin Wall at the Brandenburg Gate early this morning. They stopped the party, but any hopes they had of stopping the West Berliners destroying the wall were soon dashed. As dozens of young men pulled on a rope and chains, the chant went up, Mauer weg, down with the wall. The reply was swift.
Чтобы сказать свое решительное «нет».
There were scenes of jubilation at the Ukrainian parliament in Kiev as men clambered up the roof to remove the red flag.
The end of the Soviet Union in 1991 was an absolute disaster for North Korea. It really showed up the fact that far from being a very, very economically independent country, i.e. what the North Koreans would say, a sort of juche country, North Korea was very dependent on the Soviet Union still. A lot of its industry depended on inputs from the Soviet Union. Its energy system depended on subsidized oil coming from the Soviet Union. It found itself in a very, very difficult position in the early 1990s. One of the things it tried to do then was to try to turn to China for imports of fuel, for imports of grain, but that didn't work out very well. China supported them up to a point, but basically did not want to or was not able to replace the Soviet Union as North Korea's great benefactor.
Without Soviet aid, North Korea became really desperate, and you saw that its economy collapsed. Even by 1991, they already had a program in place telling North Koreans that you can only eat 2 meals a day.
그러한 그 정치적 행사에 쓰고 있는 비용이 정확한 추산은 어렵지만 연간 10수억 불 정도가 되는 것 같습니다. 이런 두 가지의 단 몇 퍼센트만 모아서 몇 퍼센트만 전략을 한다면은 북한의 식량난은 상당 부분 해결될 수 있습니다.
So the famine that hit North Korea in the mid-1990s was incredibly devastating. Possibly as many as 4 million people died just due to starvation. There was just a complete collapse of the distribution system, the food distribution system. And this was largely caused by the lack of aid from the Soviet Union. As this aid dropped and as the imports, the energy imports from the Soviet Union dropped, they were no longer able to produce agricultural products and in the way that they had before. You also saw that North Korea was hit really hard by droughts and flooding. And then you saw a complete breakdown of the food distribution system.
As you might expect, the elite based in the capital in Pyongyang, and then of course around the new leader Kim Jong-il and all his sort of family and acolytes, they were not suffering from famine. There's always a class of people and a group of people who don't suffer from that famine. But in North Korean propaganda, the way in which they tried to spin the famine was to talk about something called the arduous march. It said that the whole North Korean people were in this together, and it was effectively like fighting the anti-Japanese struggle of the 1930s. And of course they weren't all in it together. People were suffering very differently depending on what class of society they were in, actually also what part of the country they were in as well. The more rural, the more mountainous countries, and the East Coast particularly, they were suffering very badly because food was not reaching those areas. Whereas the more urban, the areas, particularly Pyongyang and surroundings, and the West Coast, those areas were still getting much better supply of food.
What was actually happening was the elites, the military, and Kim Jong-il and his children were living lives of luxury, continuing to eat delicacies flown in from China and from Western countries, while the average North Korean was starving.
The North Korean famine of the 1990s highlighted the fragility of authoritarian regimes. At the same time, post-Soviet Russia faced its own struggles with economic turmoil and political instability under Boris Yeltsin. As North Korea clung to isolation, Russia sought global reintegration but faltered, creating an opening for Vladimir Putin's rise.
There's an interesting story about how Putin first gets to be prime minister. He's appointed prime minister by Boris Yeltsin at the end of the 1990s. This is really important because Yeltsin is looking for the right successor. Yeltsin is very anxious about leaving office because if he leaves office, he's very worried that people will want to get revenge for various things that happened. What Yeltsin wants is a peaceful retirement, and in order to get a peaceful retirement, he needs to hand over power to somebody who he trusts. And why does he end up settling on Putin? answer, because Putin manages to deal with a corruption scandal that's very greatly bothering Yeltsin and deal with it in an extremely efficient and ruthless way. This is the so-called Mabitex affair. Russian newspapers publish details of a project to refurbish the Kremlin, which has been given to a Swiss-owned firm, which is owned by a rather dodgy Albanian businessman. And they also publish credit card statements from Yeltsin's daughters, which show that the company which has been given the contract to refurbish the Kremlin has paid hundreds of thousands of dollars onto the credit cards of Yeltsin's daughters. And the Russian prosecutor general announces an investigation into this. So in other words, the clouds of corruption are surrounding Yeltsin. Now Putin at this time is head of the FSB. He decides that he is going to deal with this in the most kind of ruthless, typical KGB style. Film is released and shown on the Russian evening news of the prosecutor general who's investigating the Yeltsin family romping on a bed and in a sauna with two prostitutes. And so, of course, the prosecutor general is humiliated and has to resign, and the story goes away. And so Yeltsin is said to be extremely impressed with how well Putin deals with that. This is the kind of ruthlessness that a leader of Russia needs. And that's the point at which Yeltsin makes Putin prime minister. Now, he's prime minister, but no one's heard of him. I think his poll rating at the time is 2% in the opinion polls. Yeltsin's is about 3 or 4%. Yeltsin is universally hated by this time. So how are they going to turn Putin from 2% in the polls to a credible presidential candidate who can beat the then favourite for the presidency, who's a real enemy of Yeltsin's, who Yeltsin thinks will be returning Russia to the communist past? And how do you do this? Well, you fight a short, victorious war. But Russia isn't at war with anybody, so there's a need to manufacture a war in order to turn Putin into a kind of war leader. First of all, there's an explosion in a Moscow shopping mall, and then a truck bomb blows up outside an army barracks in the southern Republic of Dagestan. And then there are 3 so-called apartment bombings where apartment blocks are blown up in the middle of the night.
Something like 300 Russian citizens, civilians, were killed in those bombings. And immediately the authorities said they were Chechens. Even before anyone came and did investigation in the place, they said Chechens did this, Chechen terrorists did this. And Putin's response was immediately send the army to Chechnya.
A serious presidential contender, and I don't think that Yeltsin's approval would add much to that zero.
And Putin makes these speeches saying, I will wipe out the terrorists wherever they are, I will find them. If they're in the outhouse, I will rub them out in the outhouse. He's using real kind of mafia slang. He's going to be the big dog who can keep the country safe from these terrorists who are just slaughtering ordinary people. So suddenly his poll ratings start shooting up. Now, the interesting thing about the apartment bombings is that there's an awful lot of evidence that these were not in fact carried out by Chechen terrorists, that in fact the apartment bombings were a false flag operation by the FSB. For example, the expertise to blow up buildings in the very precise way that it was done, the explosive which was used to do them, which was only available to the Russian state. There was a failed bombing in the city of Ryazan. The people who planted the explosives were actually caught and turned out to be FSB agents. And then the head of the FSB comes out and says, well, no, that wasn't an attempted bombing at all. That was a training exercise by the FSB. So really, one might say that this is the kind of founding crime of the Putin regime, that actually Putin was prepared from the start to see hundreds of his own people blown up in order to secure his political power.
The North Korean regime wants to show that the handover from father to son to the third generation of the dynasty is backed by its vast army. The world will now watch and wait to see what the young leader will do with his new power.
The death of Kim Jong-il generated tremendous grief and an outpouring of grief like you've never seen before, where people were competing to be the most grief-stricken, screaming and crying and clutching onto one another and on their knees, competing to show that they were the most loyal. And maybe some of them really believed this. Maybe some of them believed that their dear leader's death was the end of their own lives as well. But for others, it was a survival tactic. Before Kim Jong-il dies, he names his son the successor. He wasn't always going to be the chosen one, Kim Jong-un, because his older brother fell out of favor when he tried to leave to Japan on a fake passport. But it was clear that Kim Jong-un possessed the types of qualities that would make him best suited to be the next North Korean leader. He was very charismatic, like his grandfather, very ruthless and sadistic, like his father, and willing to do whatever it took.
Kim Jong-un had an interesting upbringing and had a kind of lifestyle not dissimilar to the sons and daughters of leaders of many countries around the world, in that he was, sent abroad to Switzerland for his education. He grew up for quite a period in a Western country and had a lot of different influences and interests. As we know, he was very keen on basketball. So yeah, he had this sort of almost cosmopolitan upbringing compared to the vast majority of North Koreans, and even compared to other people in his own family.
So for many dictators that actually experienced some time in the West, we found that there is no indication that spending any time in the West will influence their worldviews and their views in particular towards democracy. And Kim Jong-un is no different. In fact, his time in Switzerland, where he was at a boarding school there, showed him that when he didn't have his family, he was just pretty mediocre. He wasn't anything special. No one paid much attention to him. So his time in the West really demonstrated to him that his only way to achieving some kind of power was by becoming a dictator.
When Kim Jong-un assumed power in North Korea in 2011, Vladimir Putin's reaction was marked by cautious diplomacy and reserved optimism. Putin quickly extended condolences and formally recognized Kim Jong-un's succession, signaling Russia's intent to maintain stable relations with North Korea. Rather than making strong predictions about Kim Jong-un's leadership style or policies, Putin and other Russian officials adopted a wait-and-see approach, quietly observing the new leader's approach to governance and international relations.
From day one, Kim Jong-un's rule seemed absolutely terrifying, particularly the way he went against any of his political opponents. He took absolutely no mercy. There were many other powerful elites and individuals encircling him, challenging his power, potentially wanting to take over, like his uncle, Jang Song-thaek, and he knew that he was going to have to get control over the elites as soon as possible in order to prove himself. So you saw very early on, and this is actually very common of many dictatorships, he sought out to purge any threats to his power, killing his uncle in 2013 and executing a series of other purges in 2015. This really proved to many of the Korean elites, who often only really respect their elders and not these younger people, that he was a force to be reckoned with, that he wasn't someone that they could underestimate, and that he was as shrewd and as savvy as his father and grandfather were.
When you look at the way that he's ruled North Korea, he hasn't made any great, shocking changes to North Korea. And I think you have to take into account that he is still the son of his father and the grandson of his grandfather, Kim Il-sung, and he still comes from that system, and he still will have been heavily indoctrinated within that system. And he still also feels himself, I guess, as being responsible for the future survival of North Korea as a state, and of the North Korean system, and of his family and its legacy. Getting into relations between North and South Korea is a very complex, messy business. There have been multiple attempts in the last, let's say, 25 years for there to be some kind of reconciliation, some kind of thawing of relations between North and South Korea, often led by South Korea, actually. But, you know, it's very difficult, because the problem for North and South Korea is that South Korea might want to improve relations with North Korea, but they're not the only two parties in the relationship, right? America is there as well. For North-South relations to improve and to thaw without US-North Korea relations improving is pretty much impossible.
Kim Jong-un's relationship with the West, and particularly the US, got off to a terrible start. As you can imagine, there was great amounts of tension between the Obama administration and Kim Jong-un, having very low levels of trust for his rapid pursuit of nuclear weapons. But things took a wild turn when President Donald Trump took over in 2016. Immediately, Trump was referring to Kim Jong-un as Rocket Man and Little Rocket Man.
We will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime. The United States is ready, willing, and able, but hopefully this will not be necessary.
And then out of nowhere, they decided to hold this huge summit in Singapore, where Trump was openly fawning over Kim Jong-un and telling the American public about the so-called love letters that they were sending one another, and calling Kim Jong-un a smart cookie and someone he truly respected. Now, in their second meeting, this completely fell apart because Kim Jong-un refused to stop his nuclear program, and that was a key concession for the US to stop the economic sanctions that they had implemented on North Korea, which had really crippled the North Korean economy.
Looking back with hindsight on it now, you know, one of the biggest problems with all this was really Trump's lack of sincerity, lack of preparation. Really, in the end, you get the sense that Trump was really about grandstanding, wanting some kind of big treaty or agreement which he could then, you know, wave around and say, look, I'm a great international statesman.
However, despite the arguably unsuccessful meeting with America, the following year in 2019, it was Russia's turn. And for the first time, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and Russian President Vladimir Putin met. This marked Kim's first visit to Russia and came shortly after the collapse of denuclearization talks between North Korea and the United States in Hanoi.
And as a matter of fact, it was one of the goals of the summit, to make Americans less happy and maybe more willing to negotiate and to make some concessions.
During the meeting, both leaders discussed regional security, economic cooperation, and North Korea's nuclear program, with Putin advocating for a phased approach to denuclearization.
Just to remind the world that Russia, A, exists, B, is a nuclear power, C, has some say on the future of the Korean issue.
This approach aligned with Kim's desire for gradual sanctions relief in return for incremental steps toward denuclearization, countering the US push for complete denuclearization before sanctions relief. Putin and Kim also underscored a shared strategic interest in reducing US influence on the Korean peninsula. While no formal agreements were signed, the summit symbolized a diplomatic boost for Kim, who sought Russia's support as a balancing force in the stalled negotiations with the US. The meeting ended with mutual affirmations of friendship and promises of future cooperation, as both countries explored potential avenues for economic engagement despite international sanctions on North Korea.
It's always hard, especially with hindsight, because as a Western leader, you have to try and build bridges. It's very easy when you're in opposition, or when you're a journalist, or when you're a voter, to say, oh, these people are scum, you shouldn't deal with them, or whatever. As a leader, you are responsible not only for the basics of international diplomacy, but also for trade. And on a slight tangent, I remember Barack Obama saying in 2016, and someone asked him about, Trump transferring his business acumen to government. And Obama said, listen, running a business is complex, but fundamentally, it's also quite simple. You have to maximize revenue for shareholders, and you have to stay within the law. As a president, as a political leader, you have to balance 100 different things, and there's no actual value on lots of them, tangible value. You have endless people who want a piece of it, who feel entitled to a piece of it, and there's no right answer. So I don't blame Bush and Blair for trying to forge good relations with Putin. Had it worked, we wouldn't be where we are now. But to an extent, I would say that the opposite was true in some ways. I think that, you can make a good argument that Obama saying that if chemical weapons are used in Syria, that would change my calculus. And chemical weapons were used, and it didn't change his calculus. And that was, that was a red line crossed. And any politician knows the basis that if you threaten something, you have to be prepared to carry it out. And especially to someone like Putin on the other end of that, that's like blood to a shark. You can't threaten to do something and then not do it. So trying to be friends with Putin in the broad sense of the word, trying to co-opt him, I don't think was a bad thing. Letting him get away with things was a much bigger mistake.
Before I proceed to the formal part, I would like to express to Her Majesty the Queen and the people of the United Kingdom our sincere condolences with the loss of the British soldiers in Iraq. It is clear for everyone that in spite of the differences that existed before, today we need to act jointly.
My message to you, Mr. President, is therefore one of admiration, respect and support. I wish both you and Mrs. Putin a most successful and enjoyable visit to this country. May I now ask all our guests to raise their glasses and drink a toast. His Excellency the President of the Russian Federation and the Russian people.
Putin's relationship with the West has changed and evolved over 2 decades. It started off as kind of hands being held out, shaken. George Bush saying, I've looked into this man's soul and he's a good guy. You know, Tony Blair, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, saying, you know, he's a man we can do business with, he's all right. Putin courted people like Blair and Bush at the beginning of his own presidency through invasion, through murder, through gangsterism, through theft, through terror. The West has finally realised that Putin is the world's latest Hitler.
For a long time, the West have had this belief, you know, that Putin is a man they can do business with. And this goes back to, you know, to Mrs. Thatcher saying, President Gorbachev's a man I could do business with. And every Western leader likes to think that they'll be the ones to sort of bring Russia into the fold. And it never fully happens because the Russians just don't think that way. And I think when they do try and call it out, it sort of causes so much diplomatic ructions. And you see this now with Biden fundamentally calling Putin a war criminal, and then the State Department start rowing back on the statements.
Oh, I think he is a war criminal. Will you be meeting with him?
There's sort of diplomatic protocols and there's diplomatic precedents and so on. But yes, and there's also the question of the UN Security Council. That, you know, there are 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, of which Russia and China are 2, and so there is an element to which everyone wants to try and play nicely, you know, even if only for the cameras.
Why do we think that we can trust leaders of Saudi Arabia? It is the same thing. I think it is the global economy, and countries rely on each other. And Russia was and is a very important country in terms of our economic conditions. Majority of the Europe depend on Russian energy. So what matters to many global leaders was more than democracy, was stability and continuity.
I mean, this is the thing, no one really knows why now. As in, he could have done it at any time in the last 8 years. You know, the invasion of Crimea and Donbass in 2014. I mean, this is the thing, that the conflict has been going on in Ukraine for 8 years now. I mean, he did it obviously in the winter because it's technically easier to go over frozen ground than it would be in the summer, although not that you necessarily know it by the losses the Russian army have taken. There's lots of speculation about the state of his health, about, you know, his own personal reasons for doing it. Again, no one really knows, and it's very tempting for people to look at pictures of his puffy face and go, oh, he must be, you know, have terminal cancer or whatever. Who knows? It's, you know, it's tempting to think of him as this, you know, this sort of mix of Howard Hughes and Hitler in downfall, sort of pacing vast Black Sea mansions, isolated, paranoid about COVID. I think it's all of a piece with his worldview.
Putin defines as success strength, anything that's revealed him to be strong, anything that's made his opponent look weak. So, you know, when he goes into these other countries and they do nothing, like going to Crimea in 2014 and stealing that off Ukraine, that was a huge success. You know, he's a gambler, he's reckless. He's like a person who drives through a red light at 100 miles an hour, and if he hasn't had a crash, he says that's been a successful maneuver. Well, you know, most people would regard that as not a particularly successful thing to have done. You know, you've always killed yourself and other people doing it, but, you know, that's fine by him. Physically, Vladimir Putin is a very slight and small man. As a child, he wasn't, you know, the pick of the bunch. One might almost call him like the runt of the litter. And there's this story that Putin always tells, which, you know, as a kind of warning to the rest of the world, that once when he was a little boy, he was chasing a rat around the apartment blocks, the very shabby apartment blocks where he lived. And as he was chasing his rat, he cornered the rat. The rat looks at Putin, Putin looks at the rat, and Putin runs away. Putin tells this story to other politicians and world leaders and says, look, if you put someone in a corner, their only option is to fight back as viciously as possible. You know, that's a kind of warning to people, you know, don't corner me, because if you corner me, I'm going to be like that rat, and you're going to be like the little Putin. So, you know, this is this kind of metaphorical story that Putin loves telling. I think what this story also illustrates is that he was the type of young boy who would run away from a rat.
In a rare and highly scrutinized meeting at Russia's Vostochny Cosmodrome in September 2023, Russian President Vladimir Putin and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un held a summit that could have far-reaching implications for regional and global politics. The two leaders reportedly discussed arms deals, technology transfers, and deepening military cooperation. Kim's dramatic arrival by armored train emphasized the summit's importance, underscoring both nations' defiance of Western sanctions and their shared interest in building a counterbalance to US and NATO influence. At a time when both Russia and North Korea are under intense international scrutiny, Russia for its ongoing conflict in Ukraine and North Korea for its nuclear ambitions, the summit was as much a message as it was a meeting. Putin hinted at unlimited potential in their relationship, while Kim offered his support for Russia's goals, signaling willingness to supply ammunition or other military resources to Moscow.
At the moment, I think we're in a really unfortunate kind of stalemate situation as far as North Korea is concerned. In a certain sense, the survival of this pretty unpleasant, repressive regime is facilitated to an extent by the geopolitical situation that it's in, by the way in which it is trapped between great powers, by the way in which it's under so much pressure from the US in terms of sanctions, in terms of military pressure.
Early on, there were concerns from the West, and particularly from South Korea, that the leadership under Kim Jong-un was more threatening than the leaders of the past because of how aggressively he was pursuing this nuclear policy. And there were concerns that he just didn't have any checks on his power, that he was willing to pursue nuclear weapons and was more brazen, more bold in his activities, and willing to take on huge risks in dealing with the West and dealing with South Korea. But with time, experts have noticed that he really is more pragmatic, and he's mostly just focused on his own personal survival than on threatening Western countries and threatening South Korea.
There's three ways that he might go, assuming that he doesn't either die or hand over power voluntarily. And at the moment, they're all pretty unlikely. The first is some kind of Western operation, either a special forces operation or a missile strike, neither of which are going to happen. I mean, he's so well guarded that even the best Western special forces in the world are not going to be able to A, find him, or B, actually do something about it. The second is a palace coup, is someone from the inside. And there's a lot of talk about the oligarchs getting together and somehow forcing Putin out. That's not plausible either. Putin keeps the oligarchs at arm's length. The only people he really trusts are what are called the Siloviki, the enforcers. They are his old guys, you know, his old friends from the Leningrad KGB. It's a very small circle who have access to him, probably less than 10, who have genuine, unfettered access to him. The problem with that is that their fortunes are tied to his. And yes, there's a stage, a foreseeable stage, where things get so bad that they could move against him, but it would need to be so bad that they would all move against him, because no one's going to be the first to put their head above the parapet. If you're a Tory MP and you want to get rid of Boris Johnson, you send a letter to Graham Brady of the 1922 committee saying, I'd like a leadership election. If you're the first guy who does that in the Kremlin, you're taken outside and shot, because someone's going to betray you to Putin. They are his underlings, but they're also rivals for his ear, his attention, his affection, and so on. And the third is a popular uprising. There was some research from a Harvard political scientist a few years ago that suggested that you only need 3.5% of a population to be really committed to change and active in doing so to get regime change. 3.5% of Russia's population will be about 5 million people, which is round about the population of St. Petersburg, around about half the population of Moscow. But again, that's so hard to imagine right now because, you know, you can be imprisoned for 15 years for using the word war, you know, let alone going out on the streets to protest. So there is a plausible tipping point if things get bad enough, but I think that's quite a long way down the line.
Despite the fact that there was, you know, such a huge shock to the system in the 1990s, and probably at that time a bit of a loosening of the state's control, now I think the state is very much in control. It's a society of very heavy surveillance. It's a society of very heavy indoctrination in which people have to frequently go to political education sessions. If you do flout the rules, then there's a good chance that you're going to disappear into the prison system.
In many ways, the Kim dynasty isn't very powerful. It doesn't have much economic power. It has an incredibly small economy. But in terms of North Korea's ability to control its own people and to maintain the Kim dynasty, it's one of the more powerful authoritarian regimes in history. And we see that they've been able to transcend the cult of personality from Kim Il-sung to Kim Jong-il to Kim Jong-un. And this is a type of dynasty that we haven't really seen before. You have to have the North Korean radio on at all times during the day. You can turn it down, but you can't turn it off. And there's only 1 or 2 channels, and it spends all day spouting the same type of propaganda, while at the same time, they really don't have that much access to alternative information. Now, they may get it through little bits and pieces here and there, but studies have shown that most of the information that the average North Korean gets comes from word of mouth. And some of that is coming from their own neighbors, but some of it might come from the outside. But it's really difficult, particularly in the formative years when you're being indoctrinated to believe one thing over and over and over again until your ears bleed. It's really difficult to change your views on things.
The current way in which North Korea isolates its people from outside influences is certainly something that is becoming more difficult. Although I think, as we've seen all over the world, various states all over the world are trying to find ways to filter information, right, that gets to their population by having like selective firewalls on the internet. North Korea goes for an even more drastic response to that, which is basically not to allow the internet in North Korea apart from for a very small number of people. North Korea is constantly also evolving and trying to find new ways to keep out influences it doesn't like and to shelter, you could say, its people from outside influence.
North Korea, the regime shows little regard for human life, even the lives of its own people. So I would not be surprised if Putin and Kim work out a deal for North Korea to send into Russia not only laborers, but also technicians and perhaps even combat troops in the months to come.
North Korea's strict internal controls and limited freedoms have long defined its regime, but these policies have also underpinned its alignment with nations that oppose Western influence, such as Russia. Recently, this alliance has intensified even further, with North Korea reportedly sending troops to assist Russia in its ongoing war in Ukraine.
We assess that between early to mid-October, North Korea moved at least 3,000 soldiers into eastern Russia. We assess that these soldiers traveled by ship from the Wonsan area in North Korea to Vladivostok, Russia. These soldiers then traveled onward to multiple Russian military training sites in eastern Russia, where they are currently undergoing training. We do not yet know whether these soldiers will enter into combat alongside the Russian military, but this is certainly a highly concerning probability.
South Korea has said that North Korean troops have been sent into Russia. What intelligence do you have, if any, that this has happened? And if it has, would you view it as an escalation? How concerned are you?
I've seen the reports in relation to this development. If it's true, then to my mind, it shows a level of desperation in relation to Russia, which goes with the points I made at the end of the short remarks about the situation, if you like, as we enter into, yes, what will be a difficult winter, but with Russia in a difficult position in numbers of casualties, the impact on their own resources. And so I say, if this is true, then to me, it looks more an act of desperation than anything else.
Intelligence indicates that North Korean soldiers, including elite special forces, are being deployed in stages. These troops are training in Russia's far east, and some are already near the combat zones, contributing to efforts such as retaking areas like Kursk from Ukrainian forces. They are also aiding in logistical support, including the supply of weapons and ammunition. This military partnership is a reflection of a growing relationship between Moscow and Pyongyang.
It's not obvious how the Russian people would be in a position to get rid of Putin. I mean, I suppose in general, if you've got rulers that you don't like and you can't get rid of them through elections, then your only alternative is mass protest, revolution. But it's very difficult to start a revolution in a police state. It's far too risky, it's far too personally dangerous. It's not just personally dangerous, it's if you're a political opposition in a police state, that's a danger to everyone you know. It's a danger to your friends, it's a danger to your family. Their only alternatives, if they don't like what's going on, is to leave the country. And I think it's no coincidence that the one human right that Putin has left alone is freedom of movement. There's been an enormous out-migration of the Russian middle classes. You don't have to purge your opposition, you can just send them into exile.
He had all the conditions. He had a huge country with amazing level of resources. It's not only oil and gas. Almost everything else you need, any kind of mineral, you can find under Russian soil. And geographically, this huge land has huge potential. Large number of people. So by considering all this as an investment and building on top of this, he could have become a very successful leader, very popular leader for Russian people. But this wasn't enough for him. He doesn't want to focus internally. He wants to make Russia a great nation, just like in the times of the Russian Tsarist Empire. And he wants to be the leader of this greater Russia. And that will be, I think this is his vulnerability. And if the Ukrainian situation, one way or another, kept under control with some kind of a ceasefire and then peace, and maybe the conflict will continue for a while, but at a lower scale, I don't think that will be enough for him. I'm sure he will find something else next to continue after that vague goal of greatness.
Putin's Achilles heel is his own ambition. I think he's overreached himself. I think that he is attempting now to do things that actually he doesn't have the manpower or material or ultimately the support to do it. I think that's his problem. He's been in power for too long. That paranoiac, narcissistic mentality has now completely in control of him. And he's no longer, he's not mad, but he's no longer got that perspective that he needs.
All of the economic progress that Russia's made in the 22 years before that decision is just frittered away.
If his end game is to make Russia as big and as powerful as the Soviet Union, he's still got a very long way to go, and he's going to have a hell of a fight, because I don't think that the free world is really going to stand for it. I don't think the people of all the countries that Putin wants to have back under Russia's control are going to stand for it. If his end game, I think, with Ukraine is to conquer the whole of Ukraine, I think he's a long way from that. If his end game is to find a kind of off-ramp and something that's going to give him a bit of territory or a bit of say-so in what's going to happen in Ukraine in decades to come or years to come, then he may be near to that.
It's hard to see how, in the long run, he's able to actually maintain his position. There's been a sort of deal with the insiders in the Kremlin, in the Putin presidency, which is, do what I want, and you are free to steal at will and live the kind of lifestyle that you never imagined. That deal has been completely broken. So what's their motivation to continue to support him? Well, in the short run, Russian patriotism. We're restoring our imperial greatness. But if that fails, what's left?
Putin's legacy will undoubtedly be one of the most hated and reviled and evil men who's ever lived on this planet. Whoever replaces Putin, I will bet quite a lot of money on it. Most of us won't have heard of him, or perhaps her. The problem with getting rid of Putin, you know, that's one thing, but who's going to replace him? And could the replacement be worse?
Ultimately, the North Korean regime is likely to stay intact for the unforeseeable future because the greatest threat to the North Korean regime isn't really the people. It isn't really technology. It is the elites. As long as the elites are happy, then he's going to stay in power.
Today, the world is shifting in a direction where power blocks and alliances are more fluid than ever. The deepening relationship between Russia and North Korea stands out as a stark and potent symbol of defiance against Western influence. The strategic bond between Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un is more than a convergence of isolated regimes. It's an alliance forged in resilience, shared strategic interests, and a desire to upend the status quo. With each handshake and covert agreement, they are building a partnership that tests the boundaries of international diplomacy and raises the stakes in Northeast Asia. As Moscow and Pyongyang grow closer, their collaboration could tilt regional power dynamics, empowering both nations to resist Western pressure more effectively. For Russia, North Korea provides both military support and a steadfast ally in a polarized world. For North Korea, Russia represents a powerful protector and a crucial source of technology and trade amidst crippling sanctions. This emerging alliance may ultimately redefine what it means to challenge a global order dominated by US interests, forcing the world to reckon with the uncharted consequences of a Russia-North Korea axis that grows bolder with each passing year.